Before she was the Black Queen, she was just a child nobody wanted. What would you become if your life began with loss? Your name became a weapon, and every person you met saw you as a piece to be moved, not a soul to be loved. This is not a story about kindness or destiny. It is a story about survival, about a little girl born in a palace of marble, who would grow to rule through silence, fear, and fire. Before she was called the Black Queen of France, before she turned faith into strategy and poison into power, she was just a forgotten orphan from Florence. If stories like this fascinate you, where beauty hides cruelty and history whispers through blood, then take a moment to like this video, share it with those who love dark history, and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of the past. Because this is the rise of Catherine de' Medici, the girl who learned to rule a world that never wanted her to live. Florence, 1519. The city stood like a jewel of marble and smoke, rising from the Tuscan hills. The air smelled of olive oil and ink, and the bells from Santa Maria del Fiore carried across the Arno River. To travelers, it was the cradle of the Renaissance, the city of Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Machiavelli. But to those who lived within its walls, Florence was a battlefield disguised as a masterpiece. The Medici family ruled from palaces carved in gold. They were bankers turned kings, men who lent money to popes and bought thrones with coin instead of conquest. Their rivals, the Republicans, whispered of liberty but plotted revenge, and above them all, the Vatican watched a spider web of faith and fear stretching from Rome to every cathedral in Europe. This was the world that awaited a child named Caterina Maria Romola de' Medici, a name so long it already sounded like a prophecy. Her father, Lorenzo II de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, was heir to the family's power, but carried little of its wisdom. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was a French noblewoman, married for politics, not for love. Their union was meant to bind Italy and France, Florence and Paris, altar and empire. But within weeks of Catherine's birth, the alliance turned into a requiem. Her mother died from fever. Her father followed days later. The newborn duchess was left in a cradle of silk surrounded by marble, servants, and silence. In that moment, Florence gained an orphan and lost its peace. The Medici buried their dead with gold and incense, but no treasure could bury fear. For in the streets, the people whispered that the family had grown too proud, too rich, too close to the church. Within a year, rebellion began to simmer. The Republicans rose again, crying out for the return of liberty. The palaces that once echoed with laughter now braced for siege, and in the middle of it all was a child, tiny, frail, and far too valuable to be left alone. Catherine's guardians moved her from palace to monastery. Always in the shadow of war, she grew up surrounded by stone walls and candlelight, watched over by nuns who prayed louder each time the cannons thundered beyond the city. The young duchess learned early that the world beyond prayer was cruel, and that silence could keep her alive. She spent her days reading not fairy tales, but history, philosophy, and scripture. The sisters said she had her father's eyes, dark, wide, and watchful, even as a child. She learned to listen before she spoke, to observe before she acted. When she was 10, rebellion returned like a storm. The Republican army, backed by France's old enemies, marched on Florence. The Medici palaces fell one by one. The child who bore the family name became their enemy's prize. Catherine was captured not with cruelty, but with calculation. A girl of her bloodline was a perfect hostage. She was placed in a convent for her protection, though everyone knew the walls were not for safety, but for control. The convent was cold. Its windows were too high for sunlight. Catherine slept under the echo of prayers and the scrape of boots outside. When food grew scarce, the sisters sold their jewels to feed her. When soldiers approached, they hid her behind altar doors. One chronicler later wrote that Catherine was a small girl with the eyes of a woman who has already seen too much. He was right. The siege of Florence lasted years. Armies of the emperor and the pope clashed in the valleys. Plague devoured the countryside. Inside her cell, Catherine learned to survive on faith and intellect. She studied languages, arithmetic, even medicine lessons meant for priests, not orphans. But the sisters indulged her, saying she was born for something greater. They could not have known how right they were. In 1530, When the city finally fell to the emperor's forces, Catherine's fate hung by a thread. Some wanted her executed, a warning to every Medici still alive. Others wanted her sent to Rome, a living hostage. But when the victorious troops broke through the convent walls, they found her calm, kneeling among the nuns, holding a single book. She did not cry, did not beg. One soldier later said, "She stared at us, as if she were the one who had conquered." The emperor spared her life not out of mercy, but out of politics. He handed her over to the Pope, Clement VII, who happened to be her Medici cousin. The child who had been trapped in war was now a pawn on a greater chessboard, one stretching from Florence to the Vatican. When Catherine arrived in Rome, she was 12 years old. The city dazzled and disgusted her at once. Its marble cathedrals shone with the glory of saints, but its streets stank of corruption. Cardinals lived like princes. Beggars died beside their gates. Catherine walked among them with quiet eyes, seeing what others ignored. The Pope welcomed her with ceremony, calling her, "My beloved niece." But Catherine understood she was not family. She was leverage. For Clement VII had plans that reached beyond prayer. He needed allies. France, England, Spain all circled the church like wolves. A marriage could make peace, or buy protection. Catherine, the last pure-blood Medici, was the perfect bargaining chip. And so her future was written not in prophecy, but in ink. In 1533, when she was 14, Catherine was informed she would marry Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. The union would bind France to Rome, and in return, the Pope would bless France's wars in Italy. The girl who had never left the convent was about to be sent into another world, a court of silk and suspicion. The journey from Rome to Marseille took weeks. Her entourage glittered with gold, gifts, and letters sealed in the papal crest. She rode in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. To most, it looked like a royal procession. To her, it felt like exile. The wedding was magnificent. Pope Clement himself officiated, an honor almost unheard of. The cathedral shimmered with candles, tapestries, and the murmur of Latin hymns. Catherine wore a gown embroidered with lilies and pearls, her hair braided with silver threads. Beside her stood Henry, tall, handsome, and entirely indifferent. He looked past her as if she were air. The ceremony ended, the bells rang, and France gained a duchess. But Henry's heart already belonged elsewhere, to Diane de Poitiers, a widow 20 years his senior, elegant, powerful, and utterly beyond reproach. Their affair was no secret. It was the pulse of the French court. And from the moment Catherine arrived, she was measured against a woman she could never surpass. France did not love her. The courtiers whispered, "The Italian girl," as if it were an insult. They mocked her accent, her solemn dress, her dark eyes. To them, she was not a queen in waiting, but a merchant's daughter who had climbed too high. And yet, Catherine did what she had always done. She listened. She learned the rhythms of a foreign court, who flattered, who betrayed, who watched from the shadows. She learned that in France, loyalty was an illusion, and love a luxury she could not afford. She had survived war, plague, and captivity. Now, she would learn the politics of charm. And as the years passed, the child of Florence grew into a woman no one truly saw, quiet, patient, calculating. She had not been born with power, but she would learn how to borrow it, bend it, and eventually, command it. At night, she would stand alone in the marble halls of Fontainebleau, surrounded by mirrors and moonlight, and whisper to herself, not in prayer, but in promise. The Italian girl with the black eyes would never be powerless again. When Catherine crossed the Alps, she left behind not just Florence, she left behind herself. The air grew colder as her entourage wound through the mountain passes, the wagons creaking under the weight of papal gifts. Inside her carriage, the 14-year-old girl stared at the gray sky, her fingers tied around a rosary polished smooth by fear. She was traveling toward France, a country she had never seen, to marry a boy who had never spoken her name. Behind her trailed the Pope's blessing and a fortune in gold. Ahead waited a court that would judge her by every accent, gesture, and glance. The Medici had taught her that life was a negotiation. Rome had taught her that silence was armor. But nothing had prepared her for the glittering cruelty of Renaissance France. The crown of France glimmered like sunlight on steel, beautiful, but cold. When Catherine became queen in 1547, she stood beside Henry II, her husband and king, in a world that had never truly accepted her. Behind them, the cathedral echoed with cheers. Before them lay the most powerful throne in Europe. Yet even as the choir sang, Catherine knew that every sound was hollow. France adored its new king, bold, strong, and war-born. But the court adored another woman, Diane de Poitiers, 50 and flawless, moved beside the king like a second shadow. Her beauty defied time. Her voice carried command hidden in grace. To outsiders, she was merely a royal mistress. To those who understood the court, she was the real queen. Henry wore her initials intertwined with his, carved into armor, embroidered on his banners. She signed royal edicts, advised generals, and controlled access to the throne. Catherine smiled beside them. Invisible, she had learned in Florence that silence could wound more deeply than speech, yet even silence could not hide the truth. 10 years after her marriage, Catherine had not borne a single child, and in the 16th century, a queen who could not give an heir was not a wife, she was a mistake. Rumors crept through the corridors of Fontainebleau like smoke. Some said she was cursed by God for her family's sins. Others whispered that her womb had been poisoned by Florentine magic. The most vicious called her barren, a word that clung to her like a brand. In a court obsessed with fertility, youth, and legacy, Catherine became a ghost among the living. Her husband, though polite in public, kept his distance. He shared his victories, his laughter, his faith, but never his affection. And Diane, the ever-gracious mistress, offered the queen advice on beauty, on posture, even on patience. It was meant as kindness. It sounded like pity, but Catherine endured. She had been forged in fear long before this court of silk. If Florence had taught her survival, France would teach her control. She turned inward. She read medical treatises in Latin, consulted physicians from Italy and Spain. She summoned apothecaries, midwives, and astrologers. She prayed, not for miracles, but for knowledge. Each night she knelt beside her bed, whispering the same question into the darkness. What is a queen, if not a vessel for the future? The answer came in fragments in books, in experiments, in the quiet faith of obsession. Catherine drank tinctures made from unicorn horn, ate powders of crushed emeralds and coral. She followed advice from every corner of Europe, fasting, bloodletting, incense burned under moonlight. When science failed, she turned to superstition. She visited alchemists in secret, men who read the stars and promised destiny could be bent. Among them was Cosimo Ruggieri, an Italian astrologer who would remain in her service for decades. He told her that her destiny was not barren, only delayed. Your sons, he said, will wear crowns, but your reign will come through shadow. Catherine said nothing, but she remembered. The court mocked her foreign ways. The nobles laughed at her remedies, her faith in the stars. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to change. She became colder, sharper. The soft girl of Florence was gone. In her place stood a woman who could smile through scorn and thank her enemies as if they were allies. And then, in the 11th year of her marriage, everything changed. In January 1544, the bells of Saint-Germain rang across Paris to announce the birth of a Prince Francis, son of Henry and Catherine. The same courtiers who had pitied her now knelt before her door. The Pope sent congratulations. The people cheered. Diane de Poitiers presented herself at the baptism, dressed in white and gold, declaring that her prayers had been answered. Henry wept with joy and kissed both women's hands. Catherine smiled, her expression serene, her thoughts silent. She knew what none of them would admit, that power, once lost, could be reclaimed through patience. The miracle repeated itself. In 1545, a daughter Elizabeth. In 1547, Claude. Then Louis, Charles, Henry, and Marguerite, 10 children in total, though not all would live to adulthood. Each child was a stone in the fortress she was building. Every cradle, every christening tightened her hold on the monarchy. For the first time, the courtiers began to speak her name with respect. The same nobles who once sneered at the Italian girl now called her the Mother of France. But Catherine did not forget the decade of humiliation. She remembered every laugh, every whisper, every hand that turned away. And she began to understand something deeper than resentment. She saw that survival was not just endurance, it was adaptation. In the eyes of the world, her worth now lay in her womb. But in her own eyes, it lay in her will. The birth of her children changed more than her reputation, it changed her mind. She began to see power not as possession, but as illusion. The king believed himself unshakable. Diane believed herself immortal. Catherine saw both for what they were, temporary. She watched the courtiers bow to Diane in daylight and gossip about her at dusk. She watched Henry make laws for the kingdom but bend them for love. Every contradiction, every weakness, she memorized. In her diaries, she wrote of destiny as if it were a science. The stars are cold, but they remember. They do not love, yet they judge. Still, even triumph had its shadow. For though she had given Henry heirs, his heart never turned toward her. At court, she was respected, not cherished. At banquets, she sat beside him, smiling while his eyes searched for another woman's. When their sons were born, he handed them first to Diane to bless. The insult was deliberate, and Catherine bore it like armor. The years that followed were gilded but lonely. She occupied herself with architecture, designing new palaces with gardens inspired by her beloved Florence. She collected books, maps, and instruments of astronomy. She began hosting scholars and artists from Italy, gathering minds that understood her thirst for knowledge. Beneath the surface of royal splendor, Catherine was building something invisible, a court of intellect, curiosity, and calculation. But her quiet power did not go unnoticed. The ambassadors of Spain and Venice described her as a woman who says little but sees all. The papal envoy wrote, "The queen is silent, but her silence has teeth." And yet, Catherine remained patient. She knew history did not favor the impetuous. The kingdom was stable, her children healthy, her husband secure. But she had learned in Florence that peace is the most fragile mask of all. In the winter of 1558, when the king prepared to celebrate the marriage of their eldest daughter to the King of Spain, Catherine stood at the window of the Louvre, looking over the Seine. Snow fell softly, dissolving on the Black River. Behind her, courtiers laughed and music played. She thought of Florence, of the convent, the rebellion, the hunger, the silence. Everything she had survived had been training for this. 10 years of humiliation had given her what no crown could. Patience sharp enough to cut steel. And now, as she watched her reflection vanish in the glass, Catherine whispered to herself a truth she had earned, not inherited. Love could be replaced by influence. The court of France had always been a theater filled with actors who believed their roles eternal. Kings, mistresses, courtiers, all glittering beneath the chandeliers, convinced their light would never fade. Catherine de' Medici had spent years watching the stage from behind the curtain. Now, as Queen of France, she began to write her own lines, not in ink, but in silence. Her children had secured her place, but they had also chained her to duty. France saw her as the mother of the Valois line. Yet motherhood did not grant her power. Her husband, Henry II, still ruled by the heart, and that heart still belonged to Diane de Poitiers. Even now, years after Catherine's triumph in childbirth, Diane sat beside the king during councils, advising him as though she were an equal. Her emblem, the crescent moon, was engraved on Henry's armor, embroidered on royal banners, carved into fountains and gates. To outsiders, it was scandalous. To the court, it was simply the natural order of things. Catherine learned to walk through this humiliation as if through fog. Every day, she played the part of the loyal queen, arranging banquets, smiling at courtiers, tending to her children, but her eyes were elsewhere. She watched how power moved, how Diane charmed, how the nobles whispered, how the king listened. She understood that the throne was not made of marble. It was made of influence, and influence could be moved, stolen, or quietly redirected. She began to build networks of her own. Servants, secretaries, governesses, people who saw what others ignored. She rewarded them with kindness and coin, binding their loyalty not through fear, but through recognition. She knew that the smallest gesture could open doors, the crown could not. The Florentine blood in her remembered the lessons of her ancestors. That power was not shouted, it was whispered. In the evenings, while the king dined with Diane, Catherine withdrew to her private chambers. She studied maps, letters, trade routes. She corresponded with Italian bankers and French merchants, learning where the kingdom's true wealth flowed. Gold, she realized, moved faster than law. Whoever controlled the purse controlled the crown. And so, while Henry chased glory on the battlefield, Catherine built her quiet empire through accountants and spies. The royal children were her fortress. She oversaw every detail of their education, languages, diplomacy, theology. She wanted her sons to speak like kings but think like survivors. The tutors found her strict but devoted. The nurses feared her stillness. Her maternal love was not warmth, it was vigilance. She had lost too much to be soft. Henry, meanwhile, fought his wars against Spain, against the emperor, against the slow decay of his own reign. He trusted Diane's counsel more than any minister's. The court called her La Grande Sénéchale, the Great Lady of France. Catherine called her nothing at all. When she passed Diane in the hall, she would incline her head slightly, her expression a perfect mask of civility. Behind that mask, she memorized every ally, every favor, every weakness. In 1552, when the king rode to war in Lorraine, he left Diane to manage state business in his absence. Catherine was officially given no power. Yet when plague struck the capital and the treasury faltered, it was she, not Diane, who took charge. She coordinated relief, reorganized supplies, and wrote personally to provincial governors. Her letters, still preserved today, reveal a mind both logical and ruthless. If grain is not delivered, she wrote, the people will not curse God, they will curse the crown. When Henry returned victorious, he praised Diane for the kingdom's stability. Catherine accepted the slight with a smile. She had learned long ago that credit was fleeting but competence endured. Years passed, and France changed. The Renaissance glittered dulled beneath the shadow of the Reformation. The kingdom fractured between Catholics and Protestants, between those who prayed to Rome and those who read the Bible in French. Violence smoldered in towns and villages. Henry, proud and unbending, vowed to crush heresy. Catherine, the pragmatist, saw only disaster ahead. She pleaded for tolerance, quietly, through letters and ministers. But her warnings went unheard. The king believed faith could be ruled by decree. Diane encouraged him, and so France drifted closer to the edge. In 1559, to celebrate peace with Spain, the royal court prepared a grand tournament, a display of chivalry to crown a generation of war. The lists were set in Paris, near the Hôtel des Tournelles. The streets were draped in banners. Nobles from across Europe gathered to watch. It was a moment meant to immortalize the Valois glory. Catherine dressed in black and gold, her face serene behind a lace veil. Henry wore Diane's colors, black and white, as he took his place on the field. The crowd cheered as the trumpets blared. It was the same play Catherine had watched her whole life. Pride, spectacle, illusion. She already knew how it would end. On the third joust, as Henry faced the young Scottish captain Gabriel de Montgomery, the air seemed to still. Lances lowered, horses charged, and then splintering wood, a single cry, and silence. A splinter of the lance had pierced through Henry's visor and into his skull. Half fell. The crowd screamed. Catherine did not. She descended from the balcony with measured steps, her gown sweeping the blood-stained ground. They carried the king to the palace. Surgeons cut and prayed, priests wept and bled him, but nothing stopped the infection. For 10 days he lingered, blind and delirious. Catherine never left his side. Diane was kept away. When the king finally died, France trembled. The court turned to Catherine. For the first time, no one mocked her accent or her lineage. They bowed. Diane de Poitiers begged to see the body. Catherine refused. She ordered the crown jewels reclaimed, Diane's estates confiscated, and the royal court cleansed of her influence. The mistress who had ruled France for 2 decades was gone within a week. Catherine's vengeance was quiet, precise, and absolute. The bells of Saint-Denis tolled through the heavy air, their echoes rolling over the rooftops of Paris like waves over a grave. Inside the cathedral, 1,000 candles trembled in their own smoke. The court was draped in black, the lilies of France veiled in mourning cloth. The king was dead. The tournament that had been meant to celebrate peace had ended with a splintered lance, a scream, and the death of Henry II of France. At the center of the ceremony stood Catherine de' Medici, no longer a forgotten queen, no longer a wife in her husband's shadow. Her face was pale beneath her veil, her hands steady on the scepter she had been denied for 2 decades. Around her, the courtiers bowed, some in loyalty, most in fear. They whispered that she had waited her whole life for this moment. They were wrong. Catherine had not waited. She had endured. When the royal coffin was sealed, she did not weep. The crowd did, but for themselves. France had lost its king, its stability, and its illusion of peace. The new monarch, Francis II, was barely 15, pale, sickly, his chest hollow, his spirit brittle, and yet the crown of France pressed upon his head like the weight of history itself. He could not bear it alone, and everyone knew it. The court quickly divided. On one side stood the boy king, fragile and frightened. On the other stood his wife Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, radiant, educated, and dangerously ambitious. And behind Mary stood the wolves who had raised her, her uncles, the House of Guise. The Guise brothers, Francis, Duke of Guise, and Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, had long dreamed of ruling France. The elder commanded armies. The younger controlled the church. Together, they moved with the precision of a blade. Within weeks, they took control of the council, replaced ministers, and filled the palace with their own men. The kingdom, once ruled by a king, now belonged to a family. Catherine saw it clearly. She had been sidelined before. She would not be again. But she was too clever to strike openly. Instead, she waited, listening, smiling, promising nothing. The Guise brothers dismissed her as harmless, a mother who prays more than she plots. They had no idea that her prayers had always been a form of planning. France, meanwhile, was cracking beneath the weight of faith. The Reformation had arrived, and with it, rebellion. Across the provinces, Protestant preachers called Huguenots challenged the Catholic order. They gathered in fields to sing psalms and read forbidden texts. In response, the church thundered back with fire and steel. Heresy, they declared, must be cleansed with blood. The Guise saw an opportunity. They promised Francis that they would defend the faith, and through it, control the throne. Catherine, however, understood that zeal was just another form of ambition. She had seen what blind devotion did to cities. Florence had burned for less. She tried to counsel moderation, but her voice was drowned beneath sermons and swords. The months that followed were chaos in velvet. The young king leaned more and more on his Guise uncles. They ruled in his name, imprisoned dissenters, and silenced reformers. They sent soldiers to the south, to Lyon and Bordeaux, to crush Protestant gatherings. The streets ran red. The churches rang with hymns of vengeance. The people began to whisper that France had 2 kings and neither wore a crown of mercy. Catherine watched it all from behind her veil of mourning. She did not interfere, not yet. Instead, she studied her new enemies. She learned how the Guise controlled the treasury, the council, and the army. She watched which nobles opposed them and which merely pretended to. She courted the latter with patience and gifts. She spoke to ambassadors, offering sympathy without commitment. She smiled at Mary Stuart, flattering her beauty while gauging her ambition. Slowly, quietly, she began to build something unseen, a coalition of those tired of Guise arrogance. Among them were the Bourbon princes, Antoine of Navarre and Louis, Prince of Condé, distant cousins to the crown and leaders of the Huguenots. They were dangerous, but useful. Catherine did not share their faith, she shared their desire to survive. At court, she presented herself as the picture of devotion, a grieving widow, a devoted mother, a neutral queen. But beneath that calm exterior, her mind was a map of alliances and betrayals. She knew she could not move too soon. Every power in France, the church, the nobility, the common people watched her. She could not afford a single mistake. Then, in early 1560, rebellion came not from the cities, but from within the palace walls. A group of Protestant nobles, enraged by the Guise tyranny, planned to kidnap the king and free him from his uncle's control. The plot, known as the Amboise conspiracy, was discovered before it began. The Guise acted with brutal precision. Hundreds were captured, the ringleaders executed. Their bodies were hung from the castle walls as warnings. Francis II watched the hangings from his window, his face pale, his hands shaking. Mary turned away. Catherine stood still. The boy who wore the crown was terrified. The men who claimed to protect him were monsters. And in that moment, the Queen Mother saw her chance. She went to her son's chambers, knelt beside him, and whispered the first truth he had ever heard. "Fear makes kings obey," she told him softly, "but it also makes them weak." From that day on, Francis began to confide in her secretly, cautiously. She did not challenge the Guise, she offered comfort. She became his shield, his mother not just by birth, but by necessity. When he faltered, she steadied him. When he questioned his uncle's cruelty, she soothed him with reason. And when he began to doubt their loyalty, she let him come to that thought on his own. Catherine had no need to overthrow the Guise. She simply waited for them to destroy themselves. The kingdom was bleeding, the court paranoid, the faiths irreconcilable. And then, in December 1560, as winter crept over France, the young King Francis II fell ill. Some said it was fever. Others whispered poison. Catherine stayed at his bedside, her hands folded, her face unreadable. He lingered for days, then died quietly in her arms, a boy who had been king but never ruled. He was 16. Mary Stuart collapsed in tears. The Guise brothers stared in shock, their empire dissolving in a single heartbeat. Catherine did not cry. She walked to the window and looked out over the frozen gardens of Orléans. Snow covered the earth like ash. Her eldest son was gone, but she had another Charles IX, 10 years old, frightened but alive. The crown would pass again, and with it, the true power of France. This time, no man, no lover, no minister would take it from her. She turned to the stunned courtiers and spoke only once. "Prepare the coronation," she said. Her voice was calm, final, absolute. The widow's crown had become the queen's. When a king dies, the realm should pause, but France did not. The kingdom was already too divided to mourn in unison. The banners of the Valois still fluttered above the Louvre, but below them, the air stank of fear. Churches were barricaded, sermons turned into battles, and towns prayed for salvation from their own neighbors. The death of Francis II had not united France. It had revealed what Catherine already knew, that peace was only ever borrowed time. She was now Queen Mother and Regent of France, ruling in the name of her 10-year-old son, Charles IX. A child on the throne, a mother in mourning, and a country on the edge of collapse. It was the perfect storm. Catherine began her reign the way she had survived her life, with patience. She moved through the court like a ghost in black silk, silent, watching, absorbing everything. The courtiers whispered again the Italian witch, the Florentine widow, the woman who ruled with shadows. She did not correct them. Fear, she had learned, was the most reliable servant. Her first task was survival. The Guise family, humiliated by the death of their puppet king, still controlled the Catholic hardliners. Across the aisle stood the Bourbon princes, leaders of the Protestant Huguenots. Both sides claimed to defend France. Both sides meant to own it. Catherine, the foreign queen with no army, was caught between two blades. She chose neither. Instead, she chose balance. She summoned Michel de l'Hôpital, a moderate statesman with a scholar's mind and a reformer's heart. The crown, he told her, must be the bridge between faiths, not the sword of one. Catherine agreed. Together, they began drafting the Edict of January, 1562, a decree granting limited freedom of worship to Protestants. It was a bold act or a dangerous one, depending on who you asked. To Catherine, it was neither. It was survival. She did not believe in religious reform. She believed in keeping her sons alive. Yet compromise, in an age of zealotry, was treated like treason. The Guise called her soft, the Huguenots called her deceitful. But both underestimated her resolve. She traveled across France with her young son, holding audiences in city halls, visiting churches, speaking to nobles and bishops alike. Wherever she went, she repeated one phrase like a prayer: France must have one king, but may have many prayers. For a moment, it worked. The realm exhaled. Soldiers stood down, preachers returned to their pulpits, and families dared to hope again. But peace in France had always been like glass, too clear, too fragile, too easily shattered. The first crack came in March 1562. As Catherine's envoys carried her edict south, the Duke of Guise, traveling through the town of Vassy, came upon a group of Huguenots worshipping in a barn. He saw heresy where there was only song. His soldiers saw insult where there was only faith. They opened fire. When the smoke cleared, dozens lay dead, including women and children. Vassy became the spark that lit the French wars of religion. Within weeks, Protestant forces under Prince de Condé seized Orléans. Catholic armies mobilized in Champagne. The realm that Catherine had fought to balance erupted into blood. She was trapped in the middle, a queen ruling a kingdom she could no longer control. Still, she refused to despair. "If I cannot end war," she told her council, "I can at least delay it." So she delayed. She negotiated, bribed, and pleaded. She sent envoys to Antoine of Navarre, promising titles for loyalty. She wrote to the Duke of Guise, urging restraint even as he sharpened his swords. She visited Charles IX daily, shielding him from the reports of massacre and rebellion. To the boy, she was still only mother. But to France, she had become the arbiter of God's fury. The first campaign was brutal. The Guise army marched south, burning Protestant towns. The Huguenots retaliated, desecrating altars and slaying priests. The Loire turned red with blood. Cities fell and changed hands like coins. Catherine, caught between both, was forced to make impossible choices. When the Catholic armies demanded her presence, she donned the cross. When the Huguenots sought her ear, she spoke of tolerance. Every promise she made, she broke in the next breath. Every oath she swore, she meant for that moment. It was not deceit, it was survival dressed in diplomacy. In early 1563, the war reached its climax outside Orléans, where the Duke of Guise laid siege to the city. Catherine, camped miles away, waited for word. She knew that if Guise won, the Protestants would be crushed, and France would become a church with a crown. If he fell, the Catholics would cry martyrdom, and civil war would never end. Then, one cold morning, a messenger arrived. The Duke of Guise had been shot not in battle, but in the back, by a Huguenot assassin. The most powerful man in France lay dying. Catherine rode through the night to his bedside. The court expected vengeance, but she arrived in silence. Guise, delirious with pain, begged for justice. Catherine took his hand and promised him peace, then ordered that his killer be executed swiftly and quietly. She wept at his funeral. Many believed the tears were false. They were wrong. Catherine mourned not the man, but the balance his death destroyed. The Edict of Amboise, signed soon after, ended the first of France's religious wars. It was a fragile peace, conditional, temporary, doomed. The blood had barely dried before sermons on both sides began again. But Catherine did not care for eternity. She cared for tomorrow, and for a brief moment, tomorrow existed. She returned to Paris with her young son, now 11, taller, sharper, already aware that his mother's world was built on smoke. The court received them in silence. Behind every bow was suspicion. Behind every smile, fear. The nobles saw her as manipulative. The clergy called her heretic, and the people whispered that she drank from poisoned cups. But none could deny one truth. France still had a crown, and she still wore black. That winter, she began her greatest performance, the Royal Progress. With Charles IX beside her, she rode from city to city, showing the face of the crown to a shattered kingdom. They crossed mountains and rivers, through towns still scarred by war. In each place, she preached peace not as mercy, but as necessity. "Blood," she told the mayors of Lyon, "is cheaper than bread, but it feeds no one." Her words, calm and slow, carried the weight of survival. To some, she was an angel of reconciliation. To others, a serpent speaking of love with poison on her tongue. Both were true. By 1564, France was no longer whole, but it was still France. And Catherine, the orphan of Florence, the widow of France, the mother of kings, remained at its center, the stillness inside the storm. At night, when the court slept, she walked the corridors alone, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the palace. She thought of the husband who had died by accident, the son who had died by weakness, and the next who would die by inheritance. She whispered into the darkness, her voice steady as ever, "God may have abandoned France, but France has not yet abandoned me." Outside, the wind howled against the stained glass of the chapel, and the candles bent toward her as if listening. Paris had always been a city of faith, but it was also a city of fear. From the towers of Notre Dame, the bells still rang for Mass, their echo rolling across the Seine like a heartbeat. Yet beneath the chimes, another sound lingered, the scrape of shutters closing, the murmurs of suspicion, the quiet footfalls of a city that no longer trusted itself. To the north, the churches swelled with Catholics praying for vengeance. To the south, hidden cellars filled with Protestants whispering the Psalms of Geneva. Between them stood the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, dressed in her mourning black, the color of both authority and regret. France called her regent, but to the faithful, she was something far less holy. The years after the Edict of Amboise had been uneasy. The ink had promised peace, but peace had never come. In the provinces, skirmishes flickered like sparks on dry grass, burned churches, looted abbeys, murdered priests. Every act of revenge demanded another. And yet, somehow, the monarchy endured, not by faith, but by balance. Catherine moved the royal court endlessly from Fontainebleau to Lyon, from Rouen to Toulouse, never staying long enough for rebellion to root. It was not mere ceremony. Every journey was a message. The crown still ruled, the king still breathed, and France, though bleeding, was still whole. She called it the Great Progress. Her enemies called it the Procession of Fear. At her side rode Charles IX, now 12 years old, wide-eyed and pale, his face both curious and haunted. He watched the processions of bishops and soldiers, the burning of effigies, the riots quelled by force. Catherine taught him to observe, not to speak. A king who listens, she told him, can rule twice. But even as she taught, she could feel the storm gathering. The Huguenots, led by Louis, Prince of Condé, demanded broader freedom, the right to worship publicly, to hold offices, to defend their towns. The Catholic League, led by the House of Guise, demanded the opposite, of France purged of heresy. And the Queen stood in the middle, her throne balanced on the knife's edge between heaven and hell. She believed, or wanted to believe, that diplomacy could tame fanaticism. She organized the Colloquy of Poissy, bringing theologians of both faiths together under one roof. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Scholars quoting scripture instead of swords, bishops debating doctrine instead of bloodlines. But compromise, in a century of conviction, was heresy to both sides. The meeting dissolved in shouting. The Catholics called the Protestants blasphemers. The Protestants called the bishops idolaters. Catherine watched the hall empty, her vision of peace dissolving like breath in winter. Later that night, she walked through the empty corridors of Saint-Germain. The candles burned low, the windows rattled with rain. She whispered to herself, not as a queen but as a mother, if they cannot share a church, how can they share a kingdom? By 1565, the Queen's progress had become an act of endurance. The court, like a traveling circus of velvet and incense, moved from one restless province to another. Catherine smiled at nobles who plotted her death, dined with bishops who called her Satan's bride, and kissed the hands of soldiers whose boots were still stained with civilian blood. She was tired, but she could not stop, because if she stopped, France would. In Bayonne, near the Spanish border, she met with Duke of Alba, envoy of King Philip II, the dark champion of Catholic orthodoxy. His message was simple: Your Majesty must root out the heretics, or Spain will do it for you. Catherine listened politely, but her heart turned cold. She had no love for the Huguenots, yet she feared fanaticism more than heresy. France, she told Alba, is not Spain. We rule hearts, not souls. But Alba's smile said otherwise. Not for long. The meeting confirmed what she already feared, that France was no longer master of its own destiny. Religion had become a weapon, wielded not by God but by kings. That night, she returned to her tent and burned half her correspondence. Words, like fire, had begun to consume her realm. When she returned to Paris, the city was unrecognizable. The narrow streets buzzed with rumor. Pamphlets called her the Jezebel of Florence, the woman who poisoned kings and slept with devils. Priests thundered from pulpits that God had cursed France for letting her live. And yet she endured it all, because she understood that hatred could be managed, so long as it feared something more than it despised her. She began to play her oldest game again, the game of appearances. She attended Catholic Mass with solemn devotion, her rosary glinting in the candlelight. Yet her secretaries continued writing letters to Protestant princes, assuring them of her neutrality. She arranged marriages between opposing factions, hoping to bind bloodlines before they spilled blood. But the balance could not hold forever. In 1567, the rumor spread that Catherine planned to wipe out all Protestant nobles at a royal gathering, the same false whisper that would, years later, become prophecy. The Huguenot leaders fled Paris overnight, gathering armies in the south. Catherine pursued them, not with vengeance, but with exhaustion. They flee, she said, because they cannot imagine a peace that isn't a trap. Her words proved prophetic. That autumn, the Protestants launched a surprise assault on the royal convoy near Meaux, trying to capture the young king. Catherine barely escaped, fleeing through the woods in the rain, her gown torn, her horses collapsing from exhaustion. Charles IX, still a boy, clung to her hand, shivering with terror. When they reached Paris, mud-caked and breathless, the queen looked back toward the fields and murmured, "France has begun her dance, and she will not stop until the music ends." That music, she knew, would be made of gunfire and screams. By winter's end, France was again at war. Catherine had failed to keep the balance, but she had not lost control. She summoned the council, demanded levies, and negotiated with foreign powers to prevent Spain or England from intervening. To her ministers, she seemed tireless. In truth, she had not slept a full night in months. Her letters from this time still exist, cold, precise, and hauntingly human. "I walk," she wrote, "on a bridge made of glass, over a river of fire. If I stand still, I will burn. If I move too quickly, I will fall." Yet she did move, and the crown moved with her. When the armies clashed at Saint-Denis, 1567, the Catholics claimed victory, but France lost again. Thousands lay dead. Among them was Anne de Montmorency, one of the kingdom's last moderates. His death left Catherine surrounded by zealots, men who mistook massacre for salvation. As the winter frost covered the corpses, the Queen Mother stood on the balcony of the Louvre, watching the smoke rise from the city. Paris burned again, as it always had for kings, for faith, for pride. She closed her eyes, whispering words no priest could sanctify. If this is God's will, then perhaps God no longer lives in France. When winter turned to spring, the snow melted to reveal not earth, but bones. The fields outside Paris were still scattered with the remnants of Saint-Denis, shattered helmets, burned banners, fragments of prayers written on bloodied parchment. France was tired, but exhaustion, like faith, was easily twisted into hatred. The Queen Mother understood this. Catherine de' Medici had seen too many wars begin with sermons and end with smoke. And now, in 1568, the smoke had returned. The flames that devoured villages were no longer just fire, they were symbols. Every torch lit in the name of God was, to her eyes, a pyre built for reason itself. She refused to let France burn again, but she knew words alone would not stop fire. The court demanded vengeance. The Catholic League cried out for holy war. The Protestants fortified their cities, praying to a God they believed had abandoned the rest of the country. Catherine was trapped between two certainties, and so she turned again to uncertainty, the only realm she truly ruled. In the great hall of the Louvre, she summoned her council. Ministers argued over troop levies and tithes. Generals demanded blood. Bishops declared divine mandate. Catherine sat at the end of the long oak table, her face unreadable. When the shouting ceased, she spoke softly. France is dying of too much righteousness. They did not understand. She did not expect them to. She began her campaign for peace, not on battlefields, but in letters, thousands of them, written in her slanted Italian hand. Letters to governors, princes, merchants, and soldiers, each one tailored to its reader, each one a strand in a web. To the Catholics, she promised protection. To the Huguenots, mercy. To the crown, stability. None of it was entirely true, but all of it was necessary. The Third War of Religion raged nonetheless. The Duke of Guise was dead, yet his name lived on a banner of vengeance carried by his son, Henry of Guise, as fiery and ambitious as his father. On the other side stood the Prince of Condé and Admiral Coligny, Protestant generals who fought with the fury of the condemned. Catherine's armies marched, but she rarely appeared at the front. She ruled from the saddle, traveling from camp to camp with her young son Charles IX, now 15. He was old enough to see what power cost and what it demanded. At night she walked the fields after battle, stepping through the fog that smelled of salt and iron. She knelt beside the dead, Catholic and Protestant alike, and murmured prayers that belonged to neither faith. "God," she whispered, "forgive France, even if France does not forgive herself." In 1569, the war reached its nadir. At Jarnac, the Protestant army was crushed. Prince de Condé was captured and executed. The Catholic court rejoiced. Catherine did not. She saw the future in his death, another martyr, another reason to kill. Coligny escaped and continued the fight, his soldiers rallying under a single cry, "For Condé! For the Word! For France!" The Queen Mother responded not with steel, but with patience. She knew the country's veins were running dry, the treasury empty, the crops failed, the soldiers unpaid. She could not conquer faith, but she could starve war. And so she did. She ordered rations reduced, campaigns delayed, negotiations reopened. She sent envoys to the Protestant strongholds, offering amnesty and land in exchange for surrender. It took 2 years of bargaining, deceit and exhaustion, before both sides finally relented. In August 1570, the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed. For the first time in a decade, France breathed unevenly, uncertainly, but alive. The Protestants were granted limited freedom, and their leaders restored to royal favor. The Catholics fumed, but Catherine did not care. She had bought peace the only way peace could be bought, with blood, patience, and lies. Yet even as she smiled before the court, she knew it could not last. Peace in France was never a settlement, it was a truce between two nightmares. In the private chambers of the Louvre, Catherine began to weave her next defense. She gathered her daughters and ladies in waiting, clever, beautiful, and loyal. They were the jewels of the French court, and soon they would become its weapons. It was a new kind of war, one Catherine could win. From that circle of perfumed intrigue, she learned who plotted rebellion, who courted Spanish gold, who whispered against the crown. Information became her shield, scandal became her sword. Even the great Admiral Coligny, now forgiven and welcomed back to Paris, fell under her gaze. He spoke softly of peace, but his eyes looked beyond the Louvre toward the Protestant Netherlands, where rebellion brewed against Spain. Coligny dreamed of France leading a Protestant crusade, of uniting the faiths not in prayer, but in war against a common foe. Catherine listened, smiling, knowing that a single misstep could ignite the fires anew. In private, she warned her son. "Do not mistake ambition for faith," she said. "Men will pray to any god who gives them power." Charles nodded, but his youth betrayed him. The boy who had once clung to his mother now longed to rule on his own. And beside him, Coligny's calm conviction began to glow like temptation, the dangerous light of moral certainty. Catherine felt it, the old pattern returning, the slow drumbeat toward disaster. She wrote in her diary that winter, "France walks in circles, always back toward the fire." That fire burned brightest in Paris, where the peace meant nothing. The clergy denounced her for coddling heretics. The mobs cursed her in the streets. Effigies of the Queen Mother were hung and burned before Notre Dame, a witch, a foreigner, a serpent wrapped in mourning silk. She watched one of those processions from her balcony, expressionless. The air below shimmered with torchlight, the crowd chanting her name like a curse. She turned to her attendants and said quietly, "They burn what they fear, and what they fear, they will one day serve." The words proved prophetic. For even as hatred spread through the capital, Catherine began planning a gesture so grand, so symbolic, it might force the kingdom to look upward again instead of inward. A royal marriage, one that could bind Catholic and Protestant blood in the same chalice. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, would wed Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir to the Bourbon line. It was madness. It was genius. A union to end a century of division, or to unleash the final storm. In the quiet of her chamber, Catherine looked into her crystal mirror, a Florentine relic said to reveal the truth of any heart. The reflection that stared back was not that of a queen, nor of a mother, but of something between a woman carved by fear, sharpened by necessity, and crowned by endurance. She whispered to her own image, "If peace must bleed, then let it bleed through me." And somewhere in the distance, as if in answer, a church bell tolled, not for mass, but for warning. The court of France glittered like a jewel, and, like any jewel, it was sharp enough to cut. In the years after the Peace of Saint-Germain, the Louvre became a theater of masks. Courtiers smiled with lips that lied, lovers whispered in the shadow of confessionals, and every gesture shimmered with intention. France, exhausted by war, had traded its swords for secrets, and at the center of it all, invisible yet omnipresent, sat the woman who wove the web. Catherine de Medici. She was older now, nearly 50, but time had not softened her. Her eyes, black as oil and just as reflective, saw everything. She had survived kings, wars, and faith itself. Now she ruled through what she understood best: human desire. The nobles called her the Serpent Queen, half in fear, half in awe. They were not wrong. Catherine understood that the battlefield had changed. France was tired of blood, but not of ambition. If the kingdom could not be ruled by piety, it would be ruled by vanity. So she gave it what it wanted. The royal court became a stage of beauty and intrigue. Balls, masquerades, hunts, and festivals filled the calendar. Poetry replaced prayer. Silk replaced armor. And behind every shimmering mask, Catherine listened. Her greatest creation was not a law or an army, it was a network. They called them les escadrons volants, the flying squadron, a name half mocking, half reverent. These were women of wit and grace, handpicked from the nobility, trained in the subtle arts of conversation and observation. They were courtiers, mistresses, and diplomats, but above all, they were Catherine's eyes and ears. They danced, they flattered, they learned. No man in France could keep a secret that survived their smile. Among them was Charlotte de Sauve, clever and mercurial, Louise de la Baraudière, whose laughter disarmed ministers, and Catherine's own daughter Marguerite de Valois, whose beauty would soon ignite kingdoms. They were her chess pieces, moving silently across the board of Europe's most dangerous court. Catherine never called them spies. She called them companions of grace. But grace, in her court, was as deadly as poison. While her flying squadron fluttered through the corridors, the Queen Mother built her empire on subtler foundations. She reformed the treasury, rebalanced the royal council, and manipulated noble marriages to bind families in loyalty rather than faith. She read every ambassador's letter before the king saw it, adjusted their tone, and sealed them again with her own ring. Her fingers touched every document in France, and yet no one could say they had seen her act. She ruled by echo, by rumor, by reflection, like the moon ruling the tide. Even her sons could not escape her orbit. Charles IX, now a man, oscillated between affection and fear for his mother. One moment, he would seek her advice with trembling sincerity. The next, he would erupt in rage, accusing her of manipulating his every breath. He was not wrong, but Catherine no longer justified her actions. "If I must choose," she once told her confessor, "between being loved and being obeyed, I will choose the latter." Love fades, fear listens. Still, her fear was not cruelty. It was protection for her children, for France, for the fragile idea of monarchy itself. She had learned that compassion was a luxury France could no longer afford. It was during these years that she brought back an old voice from her past, a man who had once predicted the stars above her rise. Michel de Nostradame, known to the world as Nostradamus, returned to court at her invitation. The mystic from Provence arrived in Paris in the summer of 1570. His beard white, his eyes clouded with cataracts, yet sharp as ever. Catherine received him in her private library, a room lined with black velvet, heavy with the scent of ink and wax. "You once foresaw my husband's death," she told him. He nodded. "And you feared it, yet survived it. What do you see now?" she asked. He looked toward the window, where the moonlight trembled on the Seine. "I see a crown," he said, "but not upon a head. I see a woman who rules through shadows, and men who will die for her light." Catherine smiled faintly. "Then France still has hope," she said. But Nostradamus did not smile back. He whispered, "Hope, madame, is the cruelest prophecy of all." He died 2 years later. By then, his words had already become her reflection. In the Louvre, The Queen Mother presided over the daily pageantry with effortless calm. She had turned intrigue into ritual, and ritual into government. Ambassadors left her presence uncertain whether they had been blessed or condemned. She could charm a cardinal in the morning, chastise her son by noon, and write to both Protestant and Catholic allies by evening, each letter contradicting the last, yet all serving the same end: stability through contradiction. Even her enemies admitted her genius. The Spanish ambassador once wrote to King Philip II, "She governs like one who believes herself eternal, and perhaps she is for her death would mean the death of France." Still, there were cracks in the mirror. The peace she had built was fragile, held together by exhaustion rather than forgiveness. The Protestants trusted Coligny. The Catholics worshipped the memory of Guise. Catherine's web could not change faith, only delay its consequences. And as her daughters and courtiers danced beneath the chandeliers, Catherine began to sense that the music was changing. Rumors reached her of Protestant gatherings in La Rochelle, of Catholic leagues forming in secret. Worse still, her son King Charles IX had begun to trust Admiral Gaspard de Coligny too deeply. The old soldier had returned from war with quiet authority and spoke to the king as a father might, with conviction, not fear. He whispered of alliances, of a new war not against the Huguenots, but against Spain. France, he said, must redeem its soul through holy conquest. Catherine heard the echo of her dead husband in those words, and knew that another tragedy was being born. In the spring of 1571, the Queen Mother retreated to her palace at Blois. There, among the tapestries of her ancestors, she walked alone, listening to the wind hum through the corridors. She had kept France alive for decades, but at what cost? Her children were strangers, her faith hollow, her reputation poisoned. The world saw her as a spider weaving deceit, but she had only ever spun thread strong enough to hold a breaking nation. In the candlelight, she traced the lines on her palm, the same lines Nostradamus had once read. "Still alive," she whispered, "still needed." A knock came at the door. A messenger entered, bearing a sealed letter. From Charles IX. She opened it. The words were few but heavy. "Mother, I have invited Admiral Coligny to court. I wish to learn from him." Catherine folded the letter carefully. Her face unreadable, she looked toward the window, where lightning flickered beyond the horizon. The serpent in silk had built her web, and now something was trembling within it. A kingdom can fall in silence, not in rebellion, not in thunder, but in whispers, behind velvet curtains. By 1571, the Louvre had become quieter, but never safer. Beneath its painted ceilings, France's fate was being rewritten by two voices, one young and eager, one old and patient. Between them stood Charles IX, torn between faith, loyalty, and the shadow of his mother. The king was 21, and for the first time, he believed himself his own master. The man who gave him that illusion was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, soldier, scholar, Protestant, and survivor. He had fought wars against the crown, and now sat beside it, whispering redemption. His presence at court was a miracle and a provocation. To the Catholics, he was a heretic. To the Protestants, a savior. To Catherine, he was something far more dangerous, a man her son admired. Admiration, she knew, was a sharper poison than hate. Coligny's return had been staged as reconciliation. The Queen Mother had welcomed him with the practiced grace of a diplomat, her voice soft, her gestures humble. But behind the veil of civility, her mind measured every step. At first, Coligny played the part of loyal subject well. He dined modestly, spoke little, and offered counsel that sounded like caution. But soon his influence deepened. The king began meeting him privately, sending guards away, discussing matters of war and conscience. Catherine, who once dictated every letter of her son's rule, found herself receiving reports after decisions were made. One afternoon, she entered the council chamber and found Coligny standing beside the king, pointing at a map of Flanders. "If we strike Spain now," he said, "we strike for God, for France, and for glory. The Netherlands are aflame with rebellion. If we aid them, we humble Philip of Spain and free Christendom from tyranny." The king's eyes glowed with conviction. A crusade, then, but a just one. Catherine spoke softly, her tone almost maternal. "France is not a crusader's prize, my son. We have bled enough for heaven." Coligny turned to her with the politeness of a blade wrapped in silk. Your Majesty fears war because you have seen too much of it. But peace, too long untested, weakens nations. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was no court, no throne, only two wills, ancient and immovable. Catherine smiled faintly. And yet, Admiral, even peace leaves widows. He bowed. The conversation ended. The war had begun not of swords, but of influence. Over the months that followed, the Queen Mother's isolation deepened. Charles IX rode with Coligny through the gardens, spoke to him for hours, and began quoting his counsel in public. Ministers once loyal to Catherine drifted toward the Admiral's circle. She, in turn, strengthened her own web. The flying squadron moved through the court, gathering fragments of gossip, the Queen's moods, the King's sleepless nights, the Admiral's correspondence with Protestant princes. Catherine read everything. She discovered that Coligny was writing to William of Orange, leader of the Dutch revolt, promising French support against Spain. The letters were cautious but unmistakable. If they were discovered, Spain would see France as a traitor and the papacy would call for heresy's extermination. It was treason wrapped in faith, and faith, she knew, burned faster than truth. Catherine faced an impossible choice: expose him, and risk plunging France into civil war once more. Stay silent, and watch her son become a pawn in another man's crusade. So she chose the third path: illusion. She began to rebuild her intimacy with Charles, not through confrontation, but through affection. She spoke to him of childhood, of family, of his duty as king and father to his people. When that failed, she played on his fear. You wish to fight Spain? She asked one evening as they dined alone. Then imagine Paris empty, burning again, children crying in the streets. Will Flanders thank you for that? Charles hesitated, but Coligny's influence lingered like perfume. We must fight for something greater than peace. She placed her hand on his. No, my son. We must fight only when there is no peace left to save. But his mind was already turning away. The king's faith in his mother was waning, replaced by something colder: guilt. Guilt for the massacres of his childhood, for the rivers of blood that had flowed under his crown. Coligny offered him absolution through action, while Catherine offered him paralysis through prudence. One spoke to his heart, the other to his survival. He was young. He chose the heart. In early 1572, the court gathered for Lent. The air in Paris was crisp and heavy with incense. Catherine, dressed as always in black, moved through the palace with silent precision. Coligny was absent, visiting his estates in Châtillon. The Queen Mother seized the moment. She convened a secret council. Among those present were Henry, Duke of Anjou, her second son, ambitious and cunning, and the Duke of Guise, the young lion of the Catholic League. They despised each other, yet shared a single enemy: the Admiral. Catherine listened as they argued over whether to remove him for the good of France. When they asked for her opinion, she said nothing. Instead, she looked into the fire. The flames danced, devouring logs with quiet hunger. If a man, she said finally, builds a house beside dry grass, one need not strike the spark. One need only wait for the wind. The council understood. The Queen Mother had given no order, yet permission filled the silence. Still, she hesitated. Even now, she did not crave blood. She craved control. Violence was a last resort, the admission that reason had failed. So she tried, one final time, to stop the storm. She proposed a wedding, a union so symbolic that even heaven might hesitate to curse it. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, radiant and intelligent, would marry Henry of Navarre, leader of the Protestant Bourbons. A Catholic princess and a Protestant prince, one bed, one blood, one France. Coligny supported the idea, believing it proof that reconciliation was possible. Charles agreed. Paris, though suspicious, prepared for celebration. Catherine smiled, not because she believed in peace, but because she needed time. Time to observe. Time to decide if the serpent should strike. In the weeks before the wedding, Coligny returned to Paris. Crowds cheered him, Protestants flocking to the city to witness what they believed was the dawn of unity. Catherine watched from her balcony as they entered the gates, banners fluttering like omens. She had not seen such hope in years, and it terrified her, because hope, she knew, demanded sacrifice. That night, she met with her astrologer, not Nostradamus, but one of his disciples. The man spread star charts before her, tracing the conjunction of Mars and Saturn. He looked up, pale. "Blood under the lilies, madam, and the lilies weep." She dismissed him, but the words followed her into sleep. Blood under the lilies. At dawn, she stood before her mirror, the same Venetian glass she had carried from Florence. Her reflection was older, harder, but not yet broken. She spoke softly, as if to the woman she once was. "You have lived through husbands and wars. Can you live through your children?" The mirror, faithful and cruel, offered no answer. Outside, the bells of Paris rang in celebration. The wedding was coming, and with it, the storm she could no longer stop. On the morning of the 18th of August, 1572, the bells of Paris sang. They rang from Notre Dame to Saint-Germain, their echoes tumbling down the narrow streets and across the bridges of the Seine. To the world, it was the sound of peace, a France reborn, a kingdom reconciled. After decades of blood, the crown had promised love. At the heart of it all stood a bride, Marguerite de Valois, daughter of Catherine de Medici, sister to the king. She was 20 years old, radiant and reluctant, her dark hair woven with pearls and lilies. Beside her waited the groom, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who would one day be king. Their marriage was meant to unite two faiths, two houses, 2 centuries of hatred. But even before the vows were spoken, the city could feel it, the unease, the tremor beneath the celebration. The Catholics gritted their teeth behind their smiles. The Huguenots prayed under their breath. Paris had been decorated like a cathedral dressed for Easter, tapestries fluttering, windows blazing with candles, the streets lined with cheering crowds. But beneath the silk and song, muskets were being cleaned. The serpent had not vanished. It had only learned to dance. Catherine watched from the balcony of the Louvre as her daughter approached the cathedral. Her black gown shimmered like morning wrapped in gold. To most, it was elegance. To those who knew her, it was armor. She had arranged every detail of this wedding, from the feast to the banners, from the ambassadors invited to those conveniently forgotten. She had even arranged where her daughter would stand, so that the shadow of the cathedral's crucifix would fall across her face as she said her vows. Symbolism was Catherine's favorite weapon, sharper than swords, quieter than death. Yet even as the bells rang, her mind was elsewhere. She saw the city from above, a maze of alleys and towers, filled with soldiers, priests, beggars, and spies. She saw the Catholic League gathering in secret, muttering about blasphemy. She saw the Protestants marching proudly in bright doublets, unaware they were walking into a trap of their own faith. And she saw her son, King Charles IX, pale, restless, his eyes flickering between joy and dread. He had wanted this wedding. He believed it would redeem him, redeem France. Catherine knew better. She had not wanted peace. She had wanted control. And control was already slipping. The ceremony began at midday. Because Henry of Navarre was Protestant, the marriage could not be held inside the cathedral. Instead, a platform had been built just outside Notre Dame, between the square and the gates. The air shimmered with heat. Incense and perfume clashed like armies. Marguerite stood in a gown of white brocade, her face serene, her eyes hidden. When the archbishop refused to bless the union directly, claiming her husband was a heretic, she bowed in silence. Henry smiled, awkward and tense, his voice unsteady as he swore his vows. The crowd cheered. Trumpets blared. The bells roared again. Paris was witnessing history, or what it thought was history. Inside the cathedral, Catherine sat motionless, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The marriage had been sealed, but she felt no relief. For in every peal of the bells, she heard something darker, the echo of another sound she had long ago learned to recognize, the rhythm of war drums. The festivities began that afternoon. Banquets filled the halls of the Louvre. Fountains ran with wine. Poets recited verses about love conquering all. But among the laughter, there were eyes sharp, assessing, suspicious. The Catholic nobles looked at the Protestant guests as if measuring their throats. The Protestants, drunk on victory and wine, spoke too loudly about equality, too freely about reform. At one table, Admiral Coligny sat surrounded by his officers. His face, aged and gaunt from war, softened for the first time in years. He spoke of the future of reconciliation, of France as the heart of a tolerant Europe. Across the room, Catherine listened without turning her head. Her smile never faltered, but her fingers trembled against her cup. Coligny's words were dangerous, not because they were false, but because they were true. She knew what truth did to men. She had seen it destroy kings, ignite crusades, and drown cities. And now it sat at her table, toasting her daughter's happiness. That evening, as fireworks crackled over the Seine, Catherine withdrew to her private chamber. The palace vibrated with music and laughter. Yet the Queen Mother felt only the weight of inevitability. The peace she had built, fragile, trembling, false, would not survive the night. Her spies had already warned her. Catholic fanatics were arming in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Priests preached vengeance in the pulpits. Someone had scrawled words on the church doors, "God will cleanse his house." And still, the city celebrated. In that dissonance, joy and terror entwined, Catherine found herself staring into her mirror again. The same Venetian glass that had reflected her youth now showed only history's exhaustion. She whispered to her reflection, "Perhaps this wedding is not peace, only the silence before the storm." The reflection did not disagree. 2 days later, the storm began. On August 22, as Admiral Coligny returned from the Louvre, a shot rang out. A musket ball tore through his hand and lodged in his arm. The assassin escaped. Paris froze. The Huguenots screamed for justice, demanding to see the king. Charles promised retribution, his face white with fury. "Find the man," he ordered. "If my own blood did this, he will hang." Catherine said nothing. She stood beside her son, calm and cold, while chaos unfolded around them. Everyone in France suspected her. No one could prove it. That night, Coligny lay wounded in his bed. The king visited him, weeping openly. Catherine watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She heard the admiral's trembling voice, "Your Majesty must be strong. Do not listen to those who serve Rome. Trust in God and in your own heart." When they left, the king trembled. "He is loyal," Charles said. "He loves me." Catherine touched his arm. "He loves God more." Outside, Paris boiled. Rumors spread faster than the plague. The Protestants armed themselves for protection. The Catholics demanded blood. Torches burned in the streets. Windows were barred. The bells of Notre Dame, silent for centuries except on holy days, began to toll again, not for celebration, but for warning. The Queen stood at her window that night, looking over the Black River. The wind carried the smell of rain and gunpowder. She whispered a prayer she no longer believed in. "God, if you are watching, look away. You will not want to see this." Somewhere in the darkness, a door opened. A messenger entered, bowed deeply, and waited. Catherine turned from the window, her face lit only by candlelight. Her voice was soft, steady, and final. "Tell the Duke of Guise," she said, "the king's enemies must not live to see the dawn." The bells began to ring at midnight. At first, they sounded distant, soft, uncertain, as if the city itself hesitated to wait. But soon, their echoes rolled through the narrow veins of Paris, crashing against the Seine, clanging through the alleys, pounding against the shutters. To the faithful, it was the call of St. Bartholomew's Day, a feast of the Church. To those who understood, it was something else entirely. It was the signal. The first doors were broken on the Rue Saint-Antoine. Then the windows of the Protestant lodgings near the Louvre. Then the streets themselves opened, and Paris exhaled violence. Inside the royal palace, the air was heavy with candle smoke and dread. Catherine de' Medici sat in silence, dressed in mourning black as always, her face hidden behind a lace veil. Around her stood guards, messengers, priests, all waiting for words. She never spoke aloud. When the bells began, she simply closed her eyes. Outside, thunder or gunfire shook the night. The king's chamber was chaos. Charles IX, pacing like a man possessed, demanded answers. "Who ordered this?" he shouted, though everyone knew the answer. No one dared speak. Through the windows, the glow of torches spread like sunrise. The king's voice broke. "My God, are they killing them all?" A courtier whispered. "It has begun, sire." Charles sank into his chair, trembling, whispering the only truth left to him. "Then let them kill them all so that none may rise against me again." The massacre spread like fire on wind. Catholic militias, armed with swords, axes, and holy fury, stormed through the Protestant quarters. They carried white crosses on their hats to tell themselves apart from their prey. Names had been written in advance, lists prepared, doors marked with chalk. It was not madness, it was method. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was among the first to die. Wounded and bedridden, he had been left under guard in his house on the Rue de Béthisy. When soldiers of the Duke of Guise burst in, he asked for mercy. They answered with blades. Dragged to the window, his body was thrown into the street below, where Guise himself stood waiting. The young duke looked down at the corpse of the man who had once humbled his father. "Recognize him?" someone asked. Guise spat. "If I did not, this would not be France." The soldiers cheered. Then they began again. All through the city, doors opened onto death. Men were slaughtered in their beds. Women dragged into the streets. Children clung to their parents' corpses. The Seine turned dark with bodies, its current slow with blood. Church bells clanged in every district, not in horror, but in triumph. The priests blessed the murderers as they passed, sprinkling holy water over swords still wet with flesh. It was said that, from the windows of the Louvre, the Queen Mother watched the smoke rise. Whether that is truth or legend, history no longer distinguishes. For on that night, faith became indistinguishable from fire. Inside the palace, chaos turned to nightmare. The Protestant guests who had come for the royal wedding now found themselves hunted within royal walls. Henry of Navarre, the groom, was seized in his chambers. His guards had been slain. He was dragged before the king, pale and shaking, surrounded by corpses. Charles, weeping and wild-eyed, demanded he convert to Catholicism or die on the spot. Henry, barely 20, bowed. "I would rather live as a sinner," he said, "than die as a fool." The priests baptized him at dawn, the ceremony performed over the echo of screams. In another wing of the palace, Marguerite de Valois, the new bride, awoke to the sound of footsteps and a pounding at her door. A Huguenot noble, drenched in blood, rushed into her room, begging for mercy. Behind him came soldiers. Marguerite threw herself between them. "You will not kill him here," she said. "Not in my bedchamber." The soldiers hesitated. They left him alive. For that act alone, history would remember her as Margot the Compassionate. By dawn, Paris was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. Smoke drifted over the rooftops, bodies piled in the gutters. Dogs fed on what priests called heresy. The massacre did not end with the sunrise. For days, the killing continued house by house, street by street. When the news reached the provinces, France followed suit. Lyon, Rouen, Toulouse, Orléans, each city held its own feast of death. Within a month, more than 10,000 souls had been purified. The Pope in Rome celebrated with a Te Deum and minted a medal in thanksgiving. Spain sent congratulations. Europe shuddered. And through it all, Catherine said nothing. In the days that followed, the court played its performance. Messengers were sent, proclamations issued. The massacre was declared a royal defense against treason. Catherine's face appeared before the ambassadors, serene, sorrowful, inscrutable. "The king," she said, "has saved France from destruction." No one believed her. But no one dared contradict her either. The English envoy wrote home that the Queen Mother carries herself as though she commands both heaven and hell. Perhaps she did. Behind closed doors, Catherine collapsed. She neither slept nor ate. She wandered the corridors of the Louvre like a ghost, her hands trembling, her lips moving without sound. The Protestants who survived fled the country or hid behind false names. The Catholics claimed victory, but their victory had no soul. And Catherine de Medici, once the serpent who ruled through silk, found herself standing over the ashes of her own making. She had wanted unity. She had found annihilation. She had wanted to save her sons. Instead, she had condemned them to rule a graveyard. In the quiet that followed, she returned to her mirror. The Venetian glass was cracked now, a long fracture running through its heart. She touched it with her fingertip, and for the first time in her life she whispered not to God, but to herself, "I did not start this fire. I only refused to let it burn without me." Outside, the city slept beneath its own smoke. The bells that had once rung for love and for faith now hung silent, blackened with soot. And when the wind moved through their hollow throats, they made a sound not of ringing, but of mourning. Morning came gray and cold, like a city that had forgotten how to breathe. The Seine carried its burdens slowly, pale limbs, torn silks, the remnants of a faith that once believed in grace. Paris was quiet now, but it was not peace. It was exhaustion. Catherine de' Medici watched from a narrow balcony in the Louvre. Below the city she had tried to save smoldered like a dying hearth. The scent of death clung to the mist. Even the pigeons had stopped returning to the cathedral towers. Behind her, servants whispered but did not approach. No one did anymore. The Queen Mother had become a shadow, feared, obeyed, and utterly alone. Her son, Charles IX, was breaking apart. He had once been the boy she had protected from every court conspiracy, every sword drawn behind a curtain. Now he was haunted by his own voice. He barely ate, spoke to no one but his mother, and spent hours pacing through darkened corridors. Sometimes she found him at dawn, standing by a window, staring at the river. "I hear them," he told her once, his face pale as linen. "The ones we killed. They call my name." Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that once would have comforted him. Now, he flinched. She had no prayers left to offer. She had used them all. In the royal council, no one dared speak the truth. The massacre had silenced the entire realm. The Guise family rejoiced. The papal envoys congratulated. The nobles pretended to see divine order in chaos. But beneath the court's polished marble, France was fracturing. The South burned with Protestant vengeance. The North whispered of Catholic triumph. Between them stretched a land of famine, disease, and silence. Letters arrived from every province, not petitions, but confessions written in blood. Cities like Lyon and Rouen demanded more executions. Others begged for peace. Catherine read them all and burned them one by one. She had ruled through charm, through fear, through the illusion of balance. But now, there was no balance left. France had chosen sides, and whichever side she stood on, the other would call her devil. At night, she wandered the halls of the Louvre, her candle flickering against the painted saints that lined the walls. Their eyes followed her serene, unblinking, unforgiving. In the chapel, the marble Christ seemed to watch her too. She knelt but could not pray. Her lips moved, but no words came, only breath thin, tired, human. She had survived siege, exile, widowhood, and treachery. But she had never known the taste of guilt. It was bitterer than poison. The courtiers still called her Your Majesty, but the people had another name now, the Black Queen. Months passed. Charles IX wasted away, coughing blood onto his silken sheets. His wife, Elizabeth of Austria, prayed for him daily, but even she could see the rot had moved from his body to his soul. Sometimes he laughed high, hollow laughter that sent the courtiers running. Once, he ordered the palace windows shut, shouting that he could hear the screams of the dead rising from the river. Catherine stayed by his side through it all. He was her son, her creation, her ruin. On a spring morning in 1574, the bells of Paris tolled again. The king was dead. He was 23. The court froze in mourning, black banners, black gowns, black silence. But behind every drawn curtain, there was calculation. The next king, Henry of Anjou, Catherine's third son, was far away in Poland, where he had been elected king. Messengers rode through storms to bring him home. In the meantime, France stood leaderless. The Guise family gathered armies in the east. The Protestants armed themselves in the south. The throne trembled on its foundations. And in the middle of it all stood one woman, no longer queen, not yet a ghost, holding the crown in her hands and wondering how much blood it weighed. When Henry finally returned months later, he came not as the prince she remembered, but as something colder. He had tasted foreign power, foreign pleasures, foreign sins. He kissed his mother's ring, then wiped his lips as if the gesture had left a stain. Catherine saw at once that he was different, beautiful, vain, cruel, in the quiet way of men who believe in nothing. But he was her son, and she had nothing left except her sons. Paris celebrated his coronation with tired enthusiasm. The fountains ran with wine, the bells rang again, The nobles danced. Catherine smiled through it all, her black gown gleaming like oil under candlelight. But when she looked into her son's eyes, she saw the same emptiness that had devoured his brother. The kingdom she had built on diplomacy and deception was now ashes beneath her feet. And yet, she knew one thing with absolute clarity: if she fell, France would fall with her. That night, as fireworks bloomed over the river, Catherine stood by the same balcony where she had once watched the fires of massacre. The light of the pyres had been replaced by the glow of celebration, but the sky looked no different. She whispered to herself, not in Italian, nor in French, but in Latin, the language of prayer and of warning. Sic transit gloria mundi. So passes the glory of the world. The wind carried her words away, and somewhere below, the people sang of their new king, their new hope, not knowing that the ashes beneath their feet were still warm. The coronation had ended, but the applause still echoed through the corridors of the Louvre. Henry III, once the radiant Duke of Anjou, now wore the weight of France upon his jeweled brow. His mother stood behind him, hands folded, eyes steady. The courtiers whispered that the Black Queen had returned to power. They were wrong. She had never left it. But something had changed. This son was not the boy who once kissed her hand with devotion. He was polished, marble, beautiful, but cold. Henry surrounded himself with favorites perfumed, painted men in lace and silk, called mignons by the mockers. They laughed too loudly, prayed too little, and obeyed too easily. The court became theater, a place of masks rather than crowns. Catherine watched it all from the shadows, her black eyes calculating. She had spent her life weaving balance between faiths, between factions, between her sons and their enemies. Now, the web trembled. Beyond the palace walls, France was burning again. The Catholics of the House of Guise, drunk on zeal and vengeance, declared themselves the true defenders of the faith. In the south, the Huguenots had rebuilt their armies, their preachers calling for justice. Every province was a battlefield waiting for a spark. Henry wanted none of it. He wanted dances, pageants, prayers spoken in Latin but sung like songs of vanity. He wanted to be adored, not obeyed. Catherine begged him to act. France bleeds, she warned, and your crown leaks through the wound. Henry only smiled. My dear mother, he said, you ruled with fear. I will rule with beauty. She looked at him and saw not beauty, but decay gilded with gold. In omia cinque sute shaptezeci chasse, rebellion kam egen. The Protestant princes formed a new alliance. The Guise family gathered troops in Lorraine. Paris trembled. Catherine, now nearly 60, rode across the country frail, exhausted, but relentless. She negotiated with rebels, bribed bishops, kissed babies, and made peace with men who swore they'd kill her 10 years before. She crossed mountains in winter, slept in convents, wrote letters by candlelight until dawn, and yet every victory dissolved before it reached the capital. Her words had once bent kings. Now they were only echoes. Henry signed treaties she had not read. He broke pacts she had written herself. He dressed in mourning black like her, but only because it matched the pearls at his throat. The Queen Mother had lived long enough to see France devour itself and her sons devour each other's souls. Charles had been weak. Francis had been naive. But Henry was proud, clever, and afraid all at once. He saw assassins in every mirror. He saw rebellion in every church. So he began to pray again, not to God, but to relics, amulets, visions. He wore rosaries around his wrists like shackles and whipped himself until the blood came. Even the priests turned their eyes away. To his mother, he said one night, I feel the devil beneath my crown. Catherine's reply was quiet. Then rule him before he rules you. But it was too late. The devil already had a name. Henry of Guise. Guise returned to Paris like a savior. He was tall, fearless, and dripping in devotion. The people cheered him as if he were the true king. Henry III trembled. Catherine saw it, the same fear that had haunted her husband before his death, the same shadow that had killed her sons. The city swelled with banners and sermons. The Catholic League demanded the extermination of Protestants once more. Every church bell seemed to toll for another war. Henry hid in his palace, praying. Catherine worked behind the scenes, persuading, bribing, warning, pleading. But for the first time, her voice did not carry. The younger men of France no longer remembered the woman who had saved the throne from ruin. They remembered only the queen who had filled the river with corpses. On a cold December morning, Catherine awoke to the sound of shouting. She was too weak to rise. From her chamber, she heard the heavy boots of guards, the scrape of steel, the scream that ended too quickly. When she asked what had happened, a servant fell to his knees. "Your Majesty, the Duke of Guise is dead. The king had him killed." For a long time, Catherine said nothing. Then she whispered, "Then France is lost." She understood the rules of power. Kill a rival, and you may win the moment. Kill a symbol, and you lose eternity. That night, Paris howled. The Catholic League rose in fury. Henry III was now both king and sinner, sovereign and murderer. And Catherine, the queen of survival, watched her final web unravel strand by strand. Weeks later, she was moved to Blois, frail, feverish, coughing blood. Her body had become what France already was, broken, hollow, bleeding inside. Henry visited her once. He took her hand, kissed it, and called her mère. She smiled faintly. "You are still my son," she whispered, "but you are no longer my king." The winter of 1588 fell like a shroud over France. Snow drifted along the streets of Blois, muffling the footsteps of messengers and priests. The Loire River, once alive with trade and laughter, now moved sluggishly beneath sheets of ice. And in the heart of the castle, the woman who had once ruled an empire of fear lay dying. Catherine de Medici, widow, mother, queen, had outlived her husband, her enemies, and almost all her children. What she had not outlived was her reputation. The courtiers still bowed. The priests still murmured her name with reverence. But in the streets, they called her other things. The Italian witch, the serpent queen, the mother of wars. It was strange, she thought, how easily a century could fit inside one body. She had worn crowns, survived sieges, and brokered peace between devils. Now, even lifting her hand to her lips felt like war. The corridors outside her chamber were lined with tapestries she had commissioned decades before, scenes of triumph, of hunting, of birth. The colors had faded. The threads loosened. So had she. Her physicians whispered that the humors of the body had turned against her. She smiled when she heard them. "They are late to the rebellion," she said softly. Every morning, she asked for news of Paris, not of wars, but of weather, trade, the harvest. Every answer felt like a ghost. Her world was shrinking to the width of her bed. Sometimes, she would ask her maids to bring her mirror, the same Venetian glass she had once used to read omens and judge courtiers. Now, it reflected a stranger skin like parchment, eyes still sharp but hollow, hair turned the color of smoke. "Is this the price of survival?" she whispered once. None dared answer. Henry III, her last surviving son, visited her rarely. He was afraid not of her, but of what she represented. When he did come, he brought gifts, perfumes, pearls, letters written in the trembling hand of a man who no longer trusted his own kingdom. Catherine accepted them with a faint smile, though her eyes lingered on him longer than his courage could bear. "You still pray for France?" he asked her once. "I pray," she said, "for what's left of her." He kissed her hand, promised he would restore peace. She nodded, knowing that promises were the currency of doomed kings. When he left, she murmured to her confessor, "I have seen all my sons die, some by sickness, some by sin. He will die by both." At night, she dreamed of Florence, not of palaces or power, but of the convent where she had spent her childhood, the scent of wax and ink, the sound of distant bells. In those dreams, she was not queen or mother, but only Caterina, the orphan girl no one wanted. She would wake trembling, clutching the rosary that Pope Clement had given her as a child. The beads were worn smooth by decades of prayers that had never been answered. "I wanted to protect them," she whispered once into the dark. "Each of my sons, each of my kingdoms, I only ever wanted to protect them." But even the walls had grown tired of listening. When news reached her that the Duke of Guise had been murdered at her son's command, she said nothing for a long time. The courtiers expected rage, or grief, or triumph. Instead, she said, "Then we have killed France again." She knew what came next: rebellion, vengeance, divine punishment. The rhythm of death was predictable now, almost ritual, like a mass without music. A few weeks later, her fever worsened. She refused confession until the very end, saying she had spoken enough lies to priests for one lifetime. When the confessor insisted, she smiled faintly. "I will make peace with God in Italian. He will understand me better that way." As her breath weakened, she called for parchment. Her final letter was addressed to her son, the king. It was written in a hand that trembled but did not falter. "My son, you rule a kingdom that no longer knows its name. I have buried too many of my children to believe in God's mercy, but I still believe in France. If you must be cruel, be brief. If you must lie, do so for peace. And if you must kill, pray first. There is no glory left in crowns, only weight. Carry it better than I did." She sealed it with black wax. Her hands shook as the signet pressed down the Medici crest, once a symbol of Florence, now a seal for history's judgment. The next morning, she asked for her window to be opened. Cold air swept through the chamber, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke. Her maids hesitated, fearing the chill. "Let it in," she whispered. "France smells like this sorrow and fire." She gazed out at the Loire, pale and swollen from winter floods. Once, she had crossed that river leading armies. Now, she watched it carry away the world she had built. Her last words were not prayers, but observation. "The crown is heavier than the grave." She died that night quietly, as if the air itself had grown tired of fighting her. The bells of Blois tolled at dawn, echoing across the river. The court mourned, though few wept. The Pope sent condolences but no absolution. Her son ordered a black mass and then went to war again. They buried her in Saint Denis, beside the kings she had raised and destroyed. For years, the people of Paris avoided her tomb, whispering that the air around it smelled of smoke. But those who dared approach said something else, that the marble effigy of the Black Queen did not look cruel at all, only tired, utterly, beautifully tired. When Catherine de' Medici died, the kingdom she had built began to unbuild itself. Her coffin left Blois under a veil of rain. The procession moved slowly down the Loire, the river that had witnessed so many of her triumphs now carrying her body toward Paris, toward Saint-Denis, toward silence. The people lined the roads not to honor, but to watch. Some crossed themselves. Some spat. A few wept, though they could not say why. The cortege passed through towns still scarred by war. Charred beams, broken statues, empty churches. France had been fighting for so long that peace itself now seemed a myth. And yet, as the bells told her passing, something shifted in the air, a pause, as if even the ghosts of the dead had stopped to listen. The Serpent Queen was gone. Her shadow, however, remained. Henry III, her last son, received the news with silence. He was sitting by a window, wrapped in mourning black, his rosary clutched too tightly. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "She was the last to forgive me." He ordered a solemn mass. No pomp, no public grief, only the sound of a single choir echoing through the chapel. When the priests intoned her name, the king's lips moved without sound. He knew that her death was not merely his mother's, but the end of his shield. Without her, there was no barrier between him and the fury of the League. He wrote a single line in his journal that night. "Now France has no mother, and I, no mercy." In Paris, the Catholic League rejoiced. They declared Catherine's death divine justice. The pulpits thundered that the witch who had drenched France in blood was finally judged by heaven. Henry of Guise had been dead for months, but his name became martyrdom. His followers filled the streets with processions, their torches blazing under banners of the Virgin, and somewhere amid those shouts, a darker whisper took hold. The idea that the king himself was next. The preachers began to speak not only of salvation, but of purification. To cleanse France, they said, the heretic king must fall. It was a prayer that would soon be answered. By the summer of 1589, Henry III was no longer a ruler. He was a fugitive wearing a crown. The League had taken Paris, and Spain had promised aid to the rebels. The king's army camped along the Seine, weary, thin, loyal only to desperation, and there, on a dusty plain near Tours, he met his unlikely ally. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince, once cursed by his mother's court. They clasped hands, two survivors of a century of blood, two enemies united only by exhaustion. "Your mother was a great queen," Navarre said quietly. Henry III nodded. "She taught me everything I know, and that is why I will die soon." They both laughed, the dry laughter of men who had buried too many prophecies to fear one more. They marched on Paris together. The League fortified the city, shouting for the Virgin, for vengeance, for France. Cannons thundered, bells clanged, prayers turned into battle cries. Henry III commanded from his tent, pale, trembling, muttering to himself. He had begun to believe that God had cursed his bloodline. On the morning of August 1st, 1589, a young Dominican friar approached the royal camp, carrying letters of supposed devotion. He was admitted to the king's presence without suspicion. Jacques Clément knelt before the throne, kissed the king's hand, and drew a knife. The blade struck deep into Henry's abdomen. He staggered, gasping, clutching his chest. Ah, the traitor monk! Guards fell upon the assassin, killing him where he knelt. But the king was already fading. They carried him to his bed, where he lingered through the night, drifting between prayer and delirium. At dawn, he called for Henry of Navarre. The Huguenot prince knelt beside him. The dying king took his hand. "You are my brother in arms now. France must live. Rule her better than I have." And then, with a breath that sounded almost like a prayer, the last Valois king was gone. The bells that tolled for Catherine now tolled for her son. The house of Valois, once the beating heart of France, was extinguished. In the cathedrals, priests called him a martyr. In the streets, rebels called him a heretic. The people, long past caring, simply called for bread. Henry of Navarre stood at the edge of the Seine, watching the city he had once fled. The crown of France, heavy with sin, soaked in blood, now belonged to him. He whispered to himself, "So ends the line of queens and sons. Now begins the line of survivors." In Saint-Denis, where the tombs of kings glimmered in candlelight, Catherine and Henry lay side by side, mother and son, architect and inheritance. Their statues faced heaven, their hands folded in eternal supplication. But to those who looked closer, the marble eyes seemed open not in peace, but in question. The chroniclers wrote that no flower grew near her tomb for many years. Others said the earth there was too tired. Some swore that, on quiet nights, one could hear the echo of a woman's voice drifting through the crypt. "France, my child, you have killed so many fathers. Try, for once, to keep a son." Years later, when Henry IV would rebuild France, paving roads, feeding peasants, ending persecution, his courtiers sometimes spoke of the Valois with pity. He would smile and say, "They gave me a kingdom to repair." But privately, in his letters, he admitted the truth. Without her, there would have been no crown to inherit. History would remember Catherine de' Medici as a monster, a witch, a queen of poison. Yet in the ledger of time, her cruelty had bought her nation time to survive. And survival, in the 16th century, was the rarest mercy of all. Centuries pass quickly when written in blood. In the quiet of Saint-Denis, where the kings of France sleep beneath marble and dust, the air remains still, as if even time itself refuses to breathe too loudly around the dead. Among them lies Catherine de' Medici, the woman they called the Black Queen. Her effigy is carved in white stone, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes turned upward. But those who come to see her do not come to pray. They come to stare. For 400 years, France has tried to decide who she was: a mother or a murderer, a ruler or a ruin, a savior or a serpent. And perhaps she was all of them. In her lifetime, Catherine had been many things: the orphan of Florence, the wife no one loved, the queen who could not bear an heir, the widow who ruled through sons too fragile to rule themselves. She was not born to power. She survived into it. Her weapons were patience and fear. Her victories measured not in land or glory, but in endurance. To her enemies, the Guises, the Huguenots, the priests, she was a creature of cunning. To her children, she was a shadow too large to escape. To the common people, she was an Italian ghost who spoke the language of poison and prophecy. Yet when the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, what remained was not the devil they had drawn, but a woman who had lived too long in the company of death. Modern historians would call her pragmatic. Her contemporaries called her soulless. But what is morality to a woman who watched kingdoms fall like autumn leaves? What is sanctity to a mother who buried her children one by one and still had to smile at the court's applause? In a century where men justified slaughter as faith, Catherine justified survival as duty. She did not burn cities because she loved fire. She burned them because every peace treaty she signed went up in flames the moment she turned her back. When diplomacy failed, she turned to deception. When deception failed, to blood. When blood failed, she kept breathing anyway. That was her real sin. Not cruelty, but endurance. France in the 16th century was a crucible, a land of saints and butchers, of scholars and heretics, of kings too pious to live and too proud to die. Catherine stood at the center of it like a balanced scale, forever weighing one disaster against another. She was not a saint, but she was the only adult in a kingdom of children with swords. If her hands were stained, it was because she touched everything no one else dared touch: the throne, the church, the fire. She had been called Madame la Serpente. But serpents do not strike without reason. They strike when cornered. The chronicles written by men who hated her painted her as an enchantress, a woman who whispered spells to control kings, who used astrologers and poisoners to twist destiny. But look closer, and the superstition fades. Catherine's magic was politics. Her alchemy was survival. Her prophecies were nothing more than a woman's instinct sharpened by fear. When Nostradamus visited her court, she did not ask about heaven. She asked how many years France had left before it tore itself apart. He told her, not many. He was right. Even now, centuries later, the portraits of Catherine hang heavy in French museums. Dark eyes, pale skin, a gaze that neither invites nor forgives. She seems to look out from the frame and say, "Do you think you could have done better?" In truth, Catherine's France was a dying world. The Middle Ages were gone. The Renaissance was burning out. The Age of Nations was being born painfully, bloodily. Her legacy was not just the survival of the throne, but the transformation of power itself. The monarchs who came after her, Henry IV, Louis XIII, Richelieu, Louis XIV, all ruled a France forged in her fire. They learned her lessons even as they cursed her name, that fear is a kind of loyalty, that unity demands sacrifice, and that peace, once lost, can only be bought with time. Catherine bought France that time, 3 decades of it, long enough for the crown to endure, long enough for France to emerge from the smoke as a nation rather than a memory. She had been accused of killing faith. But faith was already dying when she arrived. She simply taught France how to live without it. In her reign, churches fell silent, but roads were built. Clergy fled, but scholars returned. The court that once worshipped saints began to patronize painters, poets, architects. The Renaissance in France, its art, its architecture, its humanism, survived not because of God, but because a woman too pragmatic to believe in miracles refused to let the world end. And still, her name carries venom. To call someone a Medici is to call them cold, cunning, dangerous. But to deny her legacy is to deny France itself. Every stone of the Louvre's expansion, every canal she ordered dug, every reform that made France a modern state bore her seal. Even the myths that condemned her gave birth to a new kind of legend, one where a woman could wield power not as ornament, but as force. Catherine de' Medici was never loved, but she was never forgotten. History, in its slow forgiveness, has begun to understand that some monsters are necessary. History is a patient sculptor. It chisels away outrage, rumor, and myth until only one question remains. What was she trying to save? For centuries, Catherine de' Medici's name has walked a thin line between infamy and fascination. In paintings, she stands draped in black, her gaze calm, her fingers cold, her presence magnetic. In plays and novels, she is the poisoner queen, the schemer behind curtains, the mother of massacre. In truth, she was none of these and all of them, because every legend begins as a misunderstanding. And Catherine's life was one long misunderstanding, a woman mistaken for a monster because she refused to die quietly. By the 17th century, her shadow had become folklore. French mothers frightened their children with her name. Behave, or the Black Queen will take you. Poets cursed her as the spider who trapped France in silk and sin. Priests denounced her from pulpits long after her bones had turned to dust. And yet, behind closed doors, kings studied her. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, learned from her example how to make fear a weapon and ceremony a form of control. Cardinal Richelieu refined her art of politics into an empire. They never said her name aloud, but they inherited her silence. Centuries later, artists would find her again. In the Romantic Age, she became a tragic figure, the woman who tried to rule a world that refused to let women rule. Painters softened her face. Writers gave her speeches she never spoke but might have. In the 19th century, Alexandre Dumas wrote her as both witch and mother, shadow and light, a woman of intellect trapped in a morality written by men. In film and television, her image evolved again. Cunning, seductive, terrifying, brilliant, the perfect antagonist for history's patriarchs. She was never allowed to be simply human. But perhaps that is immortality. The feminist historians of the 20th century looked at her differently. They saw not the poison, but the paradox. Here was a woman born in an age where queens were pawns, who turned her marriage, her widowhood, and her motherhood into instruments of power. She commanded armies without lifting a sword. She ruled through 10 kings and 2 religions. And she survived in a world that had no language for female strength except fear. When modern scholars read her letters, they found no spells, no confessions, no madness, only reason. Her words were practical, cold, exact. She wrote like a strategist, not a sorceress. Like a mother who understood that mercy was a luxury the century could not afford. Even her enemies could not erase her. The Louvre still stands, its wings and galleries born of her vision. The Tuileries Gardens, once her private refuge, became the beating heart of Paris. The canals of Languedoc, the academies she founded, the architects she brought from Florence all carry her signature. Walk through France today, and her fingerprints linger on the stones. In the symmetry of palaces, in the discipline of bureaucracy, in the strange French blend of grace and cruelty, the legacy of a woman who learned that beauty and control are 2 sides of the same mirror. She built not just monuments, but mentality. In modern memory, Catherine de' Medici has become a mirror herself. Every generation sees something different in her reflection. To some, she is still the serpent who poisoned princes. To others, she is the mother of modern France, the first to understand that the state must outlive the ruler. Between those 2 images lies the truth. She was a woman in the wrong century, wielding the only weapon history allowed her, her mind. She did not rule for glory. She ruled so that France would have a tomorrow to regret her. Imagine her now not as the monster of pamphlets or the saint of revisionists, but as she truly might have been in her final years. A woman sitting alone in a vast, dim corridor. The candles burned low. The walls breathed with the chill of centuries. She held in her hands the ring of her dead husband, the miniature portraits of her sons all gone, all buried beneath her name. Outside, the wind moved through the empty halls of Cheverny, her favorite castle. It whistled through doorways like memory itself, soft, relentless. Some say that on nights when the moon is high and the air cold, that wind sounds almost like a whisper, not of anger, not of regret, but of endurance. They feared me, it says. They blamed me, but without me, France would have burned before my heart did. In the end, that is her legacy. She was the bridge between eras, between medieval faith and modern statecraft, between superstition and reason, between survival and salvation. Catherine de' Medici did not end the wars of her time. She merely kept them from devouring the kingdom whole. And that, in the 16th century, was the closest thing to peace. History calls her Black Queen, but darkness is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply the color of endurance. As dawn breaks over the Seine, the light spills through the glass of the Louvre she once expanded, soft, golden, indifferent. Tourists walk the halls where her portraits hang, unaware that the woman in the frame once decided who lived and who died. Outside, the fountains murmur, the city breathes, and in that sound, in the quiet persistence of France itself, Catherine de' Medici still lives, the serpent, the mother, The queen, the woman who refused to let her country die. History does not thank those who survive. It only remembers those who die beautifully. Catherine de' Medici did neither. She endured and left behind a France strong enough to judge her. The poets called her wicked. The priests called her cursed. But the historians who came later understood that every empire needs its shadow. And she was France's, the Serpent Queen, the mother of ashes, the architect of survival. The wind through her empty castle still carries her voice, not proud, not pleading, just patient. I built you a kingdom, it seems to whisper, now keep it. And if you've walked with her this far through the fire of history, remember, not all monsters are born. Some are made to hold the world together while it burns. Subscribe to Remember the Forgotten, because history never ends.